Hello, it's Ron Campbell once again, and this is Law Module 11. And this module is about the law of torts, a very unusual law, for you see, this law is not written down. So, how do you as a consumer or as a business operator know whether or not you're violating this law? Well, here's the answer. You are to do what is reasonable under the circumstances to keep somebody from being injured, either an injury to their person or injury to their family member or injury to their property. A jury is going to hold you accountable if you are not performing to avoid an injury. The law of torts is a lawsuit from one person to the other or against a company for injuries. Now, coming up is a courtroom decision, and you're going to have to listen very carefully to the facts and to decide who should prevail. Should it be the plaintiff or should it be the defendant? And when you know in your own mind which one should win, then send me an email and let me know. Is it the plaintiff or is it the defendant or is there somebody else not named in the lawsuit who ought to win? Be sure to send me the email, and then I'll give you the answer. But coming up right now is the courtroom decision of Fanny's fractured Fanny.
We have the right to be free from being hurt by others. Injuries are painful and expensive, but whose job is it to keep public places safe? Can we sue a church when we as a guest are hurt? That's the question for today's court case, the case of Franny's fractured Fanny. You will be surprised at the answer. And now the courtroom decision. She had just gotten her hair fixed up at the new beauty salon. Franny was feeling truly good about herself. This week she had lost 3 pounds on her weight loss program. In just a short time, her daughter was getting married, and Franny, as the bride's mother, needed to take off some pounds. When Franny arrived at her weight loss group meeting in the church basement, the rain was pounding. Rainwater had leaked under the outside door and created a wet puddle. The group leader saw the hazardous condition and thought that the church janitor would take care of the wet mess. Well, you know what happened next. Franny did not see the wet spot when she slipped and fell. Franny broke her hip. Her hospital bill was thousands of dollars. She sued the weight loss group, its leader, and the church to pay all her medical costs. At the trial, the weight loss leader said,
I was greeting all the members when they came in, and they had to be weighed before the program could begin. It is not my job to clean up wet spots on the floor.
The church preacher testified,
Our church only charges $75 a night for the group to use our basement for their meetings. We don't have a janitor or anyone available at night. We are truly sorry that Franny got hurt, but it is not the fault of the church that this lady was hurt. We don't have the money to pay her medical bills.
The decision is now up to you. If you were on the jury, how would you decide? Can a church be sued? Consider carefully the actual decision of the jury in a moment.
Defamation torts protect an individual's reputation against damage resulting from untrue statements made about him.
Now, defamation refers to defamatory remarks. And these things are basically words that harm a person's reputation because they're untrue and just, well, not very nice. Like, say I call my pal a kleptomaniac. Well, that's not too cool because it's untrue.
I'm not afraid of closed spaces.
2 types of defamation are libel and slander. Libel is defamation that's printed or written, like in a newspaper or magazine. It can be in a physical form, such as a picture or a statue or a billboard. Slander is oral defamation, statements made by one person to another in conversation or on the telephone. There's a twist here, though. Statements made by means of broadcast media, like radio or TV, are libel, even though they're oral. That's because they're as widely disseminated as they would be if they were in print.
So you're likely to end up in hot water if you're responsible for any unauthorized publication or broadcast of false statements about someone. Defamation is covered by tort law because society wants to protect people from harm. And when we say harm in this sense, it's different from the harm caused by battery or assault. We're not talking about a physical ouch harm, but a harm to one's reputation and name.
The 2 main harms which may occur due to defamation are, first, the individual's loss of respect from a community, and second, the lowering of the desire of others to be associated with him.
Negligence is not doing something that a reasonable person, guided by considerations that ordinarily reflect human affairs, would do.
Oh, sorry. In standard deviant terms, negligence is like intentional torts, only without the intent. If your carelessness results in harm to another, even if you didn't want to harm that person or think that person could be harmed, then you're negligent. And so, negligence is a tort.
In order for an action to be considered negligent, it must meet 4 criteria. They are duty, breach of duty, actual and proximate cause, and injury.
Let's take a look at these elements as we apply each to a possible, yet fictional, case of negligence. We're going to start with duty. Duty is the first required element for an act to be considered negligent. Duty refers to the concept that everyone in society has a responsibility to avoid acts which are unreasonably risky to others. For example, each of us has a duty to use care when handling explosives.
Ooh, little fishies! The second element of negligence is breach of duty.
Breach of duty occurs only after duty has been established. Duty must be violated by some unreasonable act that causes someone harm.
For example, let's take the incident between Arnold's Asthma Emporium and his landlady, Ms. Perturb. Arnold's been researching a new asthma spray to help him breathe easier. Last week, he created a formula using a rare rainforest plant, the maker urine fern, and methane. Arnold had to mix the 2 active ingredients together, plus some other stuff at high temperature. The only problem was that methane had a distressing tendency to explode in the presence of fire, and Arnold didn't bother covering the mixing pot before he turned on his burner. You can probably guess what happened next.
Arnold! Arnold, are you in there?
It worked! The maker urine fern worked!
Arnold, I'm gonna sue your pants off!
So Arnold breached his duty to Miss Perturb and the rest of the community by carelessly handling a leaking pot of maker urine fern and methane. And that makes duty and breach of duty the first 2 elements of negligence. Now the third of the 4 required elements of negligence is actual and proximate cause. Actual and proximate cause requires that the breach of duty was the cause of the harm inflicted upon the victim. In other words, Ms. Perturb would first have to prove that Arnold's explosion actually caused her ear and foot damage.
She then must also show that this cause was proximate. And what does proximate mean? Well, the injury must not be a remote and unforeseeable consequence of the breach. In other words, there must be a likely and logical connection between the breach of duty and the victim's injuries, like the rubble that fell on Ms. Perturb's foot and the noise from the blast, which definitely were causes of her injuries. And Arnold's actions definitely caused the noises and the falling of the rubble. Thus, Arnold, the defendant, is liable. How about an example of when a cause is too remote?
Let's say Miss Perturb had a pedicure appointment scheduled for the day after the explosion. Well, due to her foot injuries, she had to cancel. As a result of the explosion, the pedicurist loses his fee. But the pedicurist cannot recover his losses from Arnold. That's just too remote.
The last required element for an act to be negligent is injury. What?
Well, I think we've got that element covered. But if there's no injury, there's no negligence case. Now make sure you note that injury can be either a physical or emotional harm to an individual. Of course, it's always a bit harder to prove an emotional injury.
You learned in the module about tort law. And remember, the most interesting thing about tort law, it's not written down. You don't know if you're violating tort law until it's too late. Because the law of torts covers when one person injures another person, or that person's property, or injures a business, and the injury could be a physical harm or an injury to their reputation. In fact, let's talk about the 2 basic types of torts. First of all, we have intentional torts. And intentional torts means the key part is the very first syllable, right here, in, where you meant to do harm. You meant to say things that were false, or you meant to write things that were false. So under intentional torts, we have the tort of defamation, and defamation has two sides to it. The first is slander. One easy way to remember this is the snake. You see, when she was in the Garden of Eden, Eve listened to the fact when the snake slithered up, he spoke false things. He spoke slander. The other, second defamation, the first is slander, and the second is libel. And libel is where there are things printed that are in a book, in a newspaper, in a magazine, and there's statements about a person that are just not true. Now, which one is going to get more of a punishment? Well, the answer is that libel is punished more because a lot more people are going to hear the false statements. If you make false statements on the internet or you do something false on YouTube, it is still considered liable even though the statements were spoken. And the key is so many people were going to hear the falseness. So, again, this is a tort where you've damaged somebody's reputation or you've hurt them by speaking a falsehood, and this is an intentional tort. Now let's take a look at the second kind of tort. And this really, really does affect business professionals, and the second tort is a unintentional tort. This is where you didn't mean to cause problems. You could be crop dusting. You could be spraying pesticides, and you did not intend to hurt anybody. But when you have pesticides, or you're dynamiting a mountain to build a road through the mountain, we're going to hold you liable even though you did not mean to have harm. And we're going to have this under the term of strict liability. It's one of two types of unintentional torts. The second accounts for about 90% of all the civil trials in the courthouse, and this is the tort of negligence. This is having something happen that should not have happened because you were not being responsible. All right, let's go back and take a look at the elements or the pieces to negligence. You saw this on the film. You know that you have to be responsible as a person in our society. Well, negligence is going to provide an injured person proof or give them some compensation if, in fact, the injured person can prove the four required elements. And the first is a duty. Now, let's assume for a moment, after you get through with this class, you're going to operate your car. Do you have a duty? And the answer is you've got to operate it safely. That is required of all drivers. The second element is you run a red light. Okay? You run a red light, and what have you done? You have breached your duty. The word breach means broke. You breached the duty because you ran the red light. All right. Just because you run a red light does not mean anybody's going to get hurt. There has to be a collision. And the collision means that there was a cause of injury. Well, wait a minute. Let's suppose you operate your car, you run a red light, you go through an intersection. Does that really mean you have to pay any money? No. Because you could hit the back end of a car, spin it around a couple of times, and nobody gets hurt. But if, in fact, there is an injury, then you have to pay. You have to pay the injured person. So, again, let's take a look at the four required elements. You have a duty. If you breach the duty, and the duty causes injury, and there's actual injury, you've got to pay under the unintentional tort of negligence.